Okay, picture this scene. It's November 2017, so we're exactly 1 year out from the 2016 US election. Right. In cities across America, you have people gathering in parks, in town squares, but they're not there to march. They're not holding protest signs. No, they are there to look up at the evening sky and literally howl at the moon. It's just such a visceral image, isn't it? The resistance movement just letting out this primal scream of frustration. Yeah, yeah. It really captures the sheer emotional exhaustion of those early Trump years. And then on the flip side, you had the never-Trumpers, right? Right, the establishment types. The sources we have call them the moon howlers' counterpart, staring in horror as their party was, in their view, subjected to a hostile takeover. Look, we are not here today to relitigate the past or to howl at the moon ourselves. All right. No, absolutely not. We've got a much more specific mission for this deep dive. We've come through a stack of essays, a lot of expert analyses to understand something deeper than the partisan noise. We want to understand the mechanics of United States power right now. So we're diving into the changing nature of U.S. power, its rivalry with China, and this is the crucial part, what this all means for allies in the Asia-Pacific. We're asking the hard questions. Is the U.S. a reliable partner? Is a new Cold War inevitable? And how do smaller nations navigate this world of giants without getting squashed? And to start, we really have to look past the surface noise. There's this fantastic metaphor from David Kilcullen, he borrowed it from Dr. Cullen Call, that describes the Trump presidency as an upside-down duck. An upside-down duck? I mean, that sounds ridiculous. I'm assuming he doesn't mean the administration was just dead in the water. No, not dead, just inverted. Think about how we usually see a functional government. It's like a duck, right? Serene on the surface, gliding along. But underneath, the legs are paddling like hell to keep it all moving. Exactly. The work is invisible. The presentation is calm. But the upside-down duck is the opposite. The legs are flailing wildly in the air. That's the tweets, the rallies, the public chaos. That's it. While the head is actually underwater, quietly eating, quietly doing the business of government. So the argument is that while we were all staring at the flailing legs, the chaos, the actual bureaucracy was sort of still functioning. It helps us distinguish between tweets and policy. If you only look at the flailing legs, you miss that the head is still operating. But the question our sources grapple with is, what happens when the rest of the world stops looking at the head and only sees the flailing? And that takes us to our first major focus, the personality factor, because how the world sees the U.S. president changes everything. Right. And Michael Wesley, one of our sources, he points out something that I found really counterintuitive. He says this obsession with Trump, the outrage, the daily analysis, is largely a Western thing. That's right. Wesley notes that if you travel to, say, Jakarta or Manila, you enter what he calls a Trump-muted zone. So they're not ignoring him, but no. It's not that. It's that he's discussed in a very businesslike, unemotional way. So while we're all doom-scrolling and analyzing every typo, Asia's just checking the spreadsheet. In a way, yes. And this reveals a fundamental difference in how power is viewed. See, Western allies, we tend to view U.S. power in moral terms. It's about democracy, shared values, the liberal international order. We want the leader of the free world to act like it. Yeah,
But for a lot of Asian nations, that moral part isn't the main thing. No, no. They view power in material terms. It's about wealth, military strength. To them, U.S. power isn't a moral crusade you join. It's more like gravity. Gravity? Yeah, it's just a fact of physics. You have to navigate. You don't get mad at gravity. You just, build your house so it doesn't fall down. But hang on, isn't that dangerous? If you treat a leader who challenges democratic norms as just gravity, aren't you kind of normalizing the behavior? From a Western perspective, absolutely. But from a pragmatic Asian perspective, moralizing doesn't change the trade balance or where the aircraft carriers are. And Trump's transactional style actually resonated in some of these places because it stripped away the pretense. He broke that post-Cold War idea that alliances were a co-investment in global order. He just pulled out a calculator and started doing cost-benefit equations. Right, he sees allies as freeloaders. He invited APEC leaders to negotiate bilateral deals, not regional ones. And by the way, no one took him up on that offer, but it shifted the ground. He made it clear the U.S. wasn't interested in being the generous guarantor anymore, not unless there was cash on the barrelhead. So if the U.S. president is operating like a transactional bully, how do allies even handle that? How to outline? Well, Malcolm Turnbull, the former Australian Prime Minister, has some, pretty blunt advice in these sources. Oh, this should be good. It is. His advice goes against almost every diplomatic instinct. He calls it the suck-up fallacy. He says flattery does not work with Trump. Bullies respect strength. He tells that story about the refugee deal. Turnbull had a deal with Obama to take some refugees. Trump comes in and just hates it, wants to kill the deal. It's that famous phone call. Trump called the deal disgusting. He said, "This is the most unpleasant call I've had today. Putin was a pleasant call," which is quite a comparison. It is, but here's the key. Turnbull didn't apologize. He didn't try to charm him. He held his ground. He basically said, "A deal's a deal, and I expect you to honor it." And Trump did. And there's another one about the steel tariffs. Trump wanted to slap tariffs on everyone. Turnbull didn't plead for fairness or talk about the long history of friendship. No, he appealed directly to Trump's self-interest. He brought the receipts. He pointed out the U.S. actually had a trade surplus with Australia, basically saying, "You're making money off us, so if you put tariffs on, you lose." And Australia got an exemption. So the lesson is, don't bring a poem to a knife fight, bring a ledger. Essentially. But there is a counterpoint to this. Emma Shortis, another analyst, she critiques this whole dynamic. She calls it having daddy issues. Daddy issues? That's a pretty loaded term for international relations. She uses it to highlight the indignity of it all. She argues that scrambling to please Daddy, the U.S. president, it forces allies to contort themselves, to align with values they might fundamentally disagree with, like anti-climate action or white nationalism, just to keep the security guarantee. It's that tension, right, between managing the relationship and, enabling bad behavior. Okay, so let's zoom out. We've talked about the personality, the upside-down duck. Yeah. But what about the water the duck is swimming in? The actual structural reality of U.S. power. And this brings us to the big debate in the sources. Are we or are not in Cold War II? You hear that term thrown around all the time with the U.S. and China. Constantly. But Sam Raghaveen argues that if this is a Cold War, it's off to a very slow start. What does he mean by that? Well, he says, look at the data, not just the rhetoric. Compare the last few years to the start of the original Cold War, the late 1940s. Back then, you had the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, a massive mobilization of U.S. forces to Europe. And today, where is the massive migration of U.S. forces to the Pacific? They just aren't there. But why not? Is the U.S. just asleep at the wheel? Raghaveen argues it's what he calls the too big problem. Explain that. Think about the Soviet Union. Economically, it was isolated. It was a gas station with nukes, right? But China, in 2019, China's economy was roughly